my question, I suppose, is just about the populist goings on in the media. If you watch Q&A regularly, they're always raising the issue of capital gains and always raising the issue of negative gearing, and the politicians always say, as you said, we'll look into it. But more specifically, the anecdotal stories of Sydney, you've got the headline in the Herald yesterday or on the media saying Chinese millionaires looking to invest in Sydney. These would be Chinese billionaires who are taking advantage of all the homeless people in China that they're underpaying in their factories for global production. Without being racist or anything, the overseas investment in the Australian economy seems to be restricted by the Foreign Investment Review Board to $100 million or more, predominantly in rural and agricultural lands that they're buying up. What can we start a campaign to limit those who are allowed to buy into the Sydney profit market, and as overseas speculators or even local speculators like real estate agents who already own 200 houses, and back in 2006 when I last moved house, they doubled the prices of everything in Marrickville and Leichhardt. One bedroom flats went from $240 to $480 overnight. And a friend of mine told me that her flat was owned by a real estate agent who used to come out and brag he owned 200 properties in the inner west. Okay. Now, can we have a list? Can somebody in the housing campaigning sector compile, go to Corporate Affairs Commission or wherever and find out who actually owns the residential houses in Sydney, and compile a list of people who own more than 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 200 houses?
Okay, a couple of things there, a lot of questions. Certainly you can, it's not very hard to find the ownership of property. A lot of that's online now. A lot of people, spend some time doing that, but, I agree with you. I think part of the speculation thing is, as Mary said, there's enough cash floating around, it's just concentrated in a few hands. I think one of the things around politicians' lack of interest in things like negative gearing, someone actually raised on Q&A a few weeks ago saying that the average number of rental properties, by federal parliamentarians was about 3. And then I think the Labor Treasurer defended himself by saying he only had 1. But I think that could be part of the problem. In terms of, there is restrictions on foreign investment in real estate. They're only supposed to buy new stock. There was that case in Darling Point or Point Piper or something that came up recently, but because through the Foreign Investment Review Board, so there is some caps on that. I mean, I think that's an issue. I don't think it's a huge reason why prices have spiked. I think a lot of the investors are local investors just trying to take advantage of the easy tax laws. You got anything to add there, Mary?
I think we've got to actually take the speculation out of housing. If our housing is going to be the thing called a roof over our head, the place we build a home, then there's a point at which we have to accept it's not where you accumulate wealth. Only sufficient wealth to put that roof over your head. There are more productive places in our economy to put that sort of wealth. It's just dead wealth when you keep investing in this speculative market about housing. The wealth does nothing other than sit there. It in effect means nothing, because if your house goes up to be worth $2 million, it means when you go to buy the next one, you're going to have to find $2 million. So how much is it really meaning unless you're cashing out at the end of the day, like leaving Sydney or dying or something like that? I think we've really got to say, like, all the tax benefits were given to homeowners because it was meant to reflect that place called home and the value that has. But actually you can love it thing too much, and that's what's happened. I think we have to accept that we have to tax that wealth in our homes in order to make our housing system fairer, in order to stop our housing being the place where you accumulate tax-free wealth.
Well, thank you very much. Marvellous presentations. Now, we are here going to do violence against women as a topic in the next very near future. What's the situation about the cuts to housing that we read about for women who have to flee a most dangerous domestic situation? Has there been cuts? What is the provision? Is there any emergency? Is there any emergency provision for women who have to leave their home, otherwise they might leave their life, particularly with all this rhetoric about how the politicians are so concerned? That's my first.
Yes.
That's my main question, actually.
Yes, there is still emergency housing available to women in domestic violence. But the thing that's actually reported more and more is that women are looking at what their housing options are. Yes, you might be able to solve the temporary problem by leaving and going into an emergency refuge or whatever, or come up with, there's a range of temporary housing type options and what have you. But they're looking at the overall housing market and going, in the long term, can I afford to leave? Because how will I house myself and my children in the long term? So Sydney's housing market of itself is actually something that is limiting people's options, and certainly people are reporting back, from where I sit, some of the service providers are reporting back that women are actually expressing reservations about their capacity to house themselves and their children in our current housing markets, and hence that they think about their options of leaving somewhat differently.
Yeah, thanks. We actually did some research about 5 years ago with New South Wales Women's Refuge Association, and one of the things that we found that was very disturbing, the main reason that women went back to the perpetrator of violence was for housing reasons. They couldn't actually figure, and a lot of times they try in the housing market on their own. They just didn't, think there were enough options. A lot of times they go back. One of the reasons they said was at least we had some decent housing there, which obviously in some cases is really a bad decision.
Oh, hi. But thanks, Mary. Thanks, Peter. You covered a lot of ground. There's another big factor that got referred to last night on the 7:30 report to do with Australia's increased population, where maybe in the top 3 of the sort of countries we normally compare ourselves to. And I just wondered, that's quite apart from overseas investors that we just heard about. Population growth generally is a mighty pressure, and especially given that demographically speaking, Australia is highly metropolitanised, more dense than, say, Netherlands, because the 2 major cities of Sydney and Melbourne take up at least maybe a third of the population. So that has a big impact on both those cities.
Yeah, there's certainly pressure on the market. The annual growth rate in New South Wales is currently about 1.6%, which doesn't sound like much, but it's probably double what the rate is in most Western countries. That's putting, pressure on the housing market. We need to keep housing stock growing. One of the things I would say about that is we also have got the biggest houses, almost the biggest houses in the world. The only country that's got more square metres of housing than us is Canada. Our houses are twice the size of UK houses, and I think one of the ways that some of that growth is probably going to get accommodated is we're probably going to have, we're just starting to see, actually in the last census for the first time, number of persons per house actually went up. Back in the 30s we had 6 people per house. Now it's about 2.5, 2.6. I think a lot of empty nesters, I think one of the things that's probably going to happen is they're going to start taking in a friend, relative, student to actually share what for a lot of people is a very vast house, and that does a couple of things. It probably takes a little bit of pressure off the housing market from the growth, but one of the things we know about older people, we did a project on older people and talked to local government community housing workers. One of the number one risks of people getting older is social isolation. So for a lot of people, the idea of sharing a house with someone else, and international students are a good target market for some people. I mean, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but for some people that could be a strategy that both has got some social benefits for them, but also might take a little bit of pressure off the housing market. But yeah, we people like living in Australia. We've got quite a high international migration rate. We're got much higher fertility rate than a lot of European countries, so population is continuing to grow.
I guess my comment is I look at those European mid-sized cities with envy because they function with all of the things you expect in a city, but without the devil's congestion that we have to deal with. And I wonder if we couldn't do better with building some other places other than just concentrating the whole population in 2 major cities.
Charlie Bradley. My question is about political will. I sort of react uncomfortably whenever anybody speaks about political will. I believe that the system of democratic representative government is actually broken, and that there needs to be some reformation of a really civil society, that is to say, a common sense and good relations between people, society, the collaboration and cooperation that is needed. So will, political will. Where's the money coming from? Why would a government come into an election promising things in the area that we've been discussing tonight when they know it would require increased taxes and that they would have to commit? Well, Fraser recommended that, Fraser, when he was sitting where you are sitting now, recommended that broaden the base of the GST. But then why would the government do that? And why would the government speak about improvements along the lines that we've been discussing when a Labor government, and it may very well have been killed off by this, all of the ructions and so on, that occurred after the people of Western Australia clearly demonstrated that they wouldn't have a mining tax. And when they were turfed out, the mining tax went away. How do you imagine that the developers would accept a development tax?
Good question, and political will is in short supply. Let me start with the developers tax. Think about the developers tax at the moment. The only way you can levy it is at the point, in the planning system before they get approval. If you can say, okay, you don't have to pay the tax, without the tax you don't get approval, with the tax you do, that's a wonderful incentive for a developer. And for a lot of them, it's interesting around developers tax. When I spend a lot of time talking to developers, doing research, what is interesting, there's a very different position between a developer and the property lobby groups who just argue developers or the world of land you couldn't possibly pay a tax. When you talk to developers themselves, they're actually a bit more relaxed about it because they see it as another cost of doing business. If they can get an approval and get on with their life, I suspect they'll be more relaxed about it. Yeah. In a lot of countries, it's pretty standard fare. We go on in Australia like, this is all too hard. Lots of other countries have been doing it for 20 or 30 years, and it's just part of business. It's, a bit like paying, GST, whatever. In terms of political will, they're not going to run screaming at it. I actually think there needs to be a bit of a coalition. And I can see an interesting coalition amongst young people, like I said. And I was actually at there was a discussion at Sydney Town Hall a few weeks ago, and one of the young people made the point that is, if you don't fix their housing up, what we're going to do is stop working. And then all your old codgers will be buggered because there'll be no tax, to pay for anything. And I thought that was actually quite an interesting strategy. But I actually think there's an interesting coalition between, younger people and their parents. I mean, their parents are pretty pissed off, I think, that their kids are 35 and they're still seeing them at breakfast. And I actually think that could be an opportunity. A lot of kids, they boomerang back to the house because the market's killing them. And I think a lot of parents are thinking that's not a great system where we were able to get a start and our kids can't. In fact, there was an interesting story. There was actually quite a serious change of policy in Victoria where they actually funded not-for-profit housing providers quite substantially over about 4 or 5 years. And it was actually driven, and this is a story on the street, it could be an urban myth, by a senior bureaucrat who discovered his kid, despite having a law degree and a good job, couldn't actually raise the money to get out of this dude's house. So he decided it was outrageous and we should do something about it. And there was quite a turnaround on policy. Maybe maybe I'm an optimist, but I can see when you see, like my students are placid students normally, when you talk about housing, their blood boils, and I actually think that you know, could be a way of incurring some political will.
I think things are changing too, because there is this concern that Peter's, like right through Middle Australia now, they're starting to be concerned about what this means. Our speculative housing market is divisive of communities and it's divisive of families, and it's grossly unfair in lots of ways. But also, like, there's some very interesting trends in this election. For the first time probably since the 1970s, the electorates of Newtown and Sydney have a majority of tenants in them. It's a long, long time since tenants have had an electoral sway. Now, as that bites more and more, tenants will again, like they used to have a solid electoral voice, because they will be the majority of people in some electorates, and increasingly more and more powerful electorates. There is a real problem about basically one generation, a couple of other, the older generations, having all of the benefits at the expense of the younger ones. There is a real serious intergenerational divide that happens here that is ameliorated only in part by the tax-free inheritance. But the tax-free inheritance is another insult to equity in itself, because basically if you come from a family that owns Sydney property, valuable Sydney property, and you don't have many siblings, and you know, your parents died of reasonable age, then you inherit quite a lot. We're looking to our future, because of our tax laws, at a society very seriously divided along lines about who comes from families with property who will be okay in a housing sense, and those that don't, won't. Now, it's a long, long time since we've looked at such inequity. You know, in 19th century Britain we looked at this sort of inequity before, but that's what we're looking at if we don't change these settings. So when I talk about political will, some of it is, yes, address the issues with the politicians and try and put some spine in them, but it's to work with our communities as well, to work with our families, our friends. Tax is a good thing. Taxing this sort of wealth is a good thing. We need to make it fairer. This is an important thing to do to make our society better. We have to win a few arguments on the grounds as well, and I'll acknowledge they're not easy ones to win, but we need to do that.
Actually, you've just answered my question, but in relation to political will, is there hope with the intergenerational rift between the wealthier, older homeowners and the young who will be forever excluded from home ownership? They'll be the constituency that will create change in terms of new tenancy laws, rent controls, and the creation of livable cities based on public transport and socialised housing. So there is hope, I believe, in the development of this constituency of the permanently young who are permanently excluded from ever owning private housing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm an optimist, but I can see some hope. But I think one of the things that you mentioned is, you know, we've got a private tenancy system that's almost assumes that it's a, you know, for a lot of people a transitional tenure, they're not going to be there for very long. For a lot of people it's going to be now a lifelong tenure. So the nonsense we've got about, you know, your landlord can evict you because, you know, they want to sell a house, or, you know, they decided they wanted to give to their second cousin, I actually think that will really change, and it'll sort of have to, because you know, you'll have a lot of people with a lot of resources that are in the rental market that just see that at the moment it's not really a functioning long-term tenure for a lot of people. So that will be, you know, I think there'll be some benefits for everyone in the rental market around that space.
You also mentioned Europe as well, the example of Europe, their livable cities, and in Europe the notion of home ownership is not really, it's very different.
It's very different. You can't, like, you have to be careful about comparing one with another and assuming it works like that. In the Northern European countries where you've got much more private rental accommodation, long-term private rental, inherited private rental, the works, you've got a different sort of investment in it. So you've got what we call institutional investors, investing for the long term and investing for much more mild, I guess, returns rather than big capital gains. They want the income flow rather than, you know, a big lump of capital gain. Whereas the investors in our private rental market are what we call mum and dad investors, small-scale investors who are investing in a speculative way for a capital gain. That motivation is all fed by our tax concessions, but we would need to try and change some of those things in order to try and encourage institutional investors back into the private rental market. At the moment, they look at this highly speculative market and they just go, why would we invest in something as risky as that? No, we're not interested, it's too skitsy. So you need to actually create a new form of investment, attracting institutional investors who, I guess the interests of tenants and the interests of the investors are more likely to line up into the private rental market. You need to change its investment structure, and we need governments to be able to use our tax system to change, to get a shift in the form of investment we get in that market, to get anything like the European type
Maybe
scenario.
generation rent will force that shift.
It's possible.
I think the other thing that, that's interesting is a lot of the European economies, you haven't got a majority of people in home ownership. So the idea of homeowners trying to get special tax concessions is just sort of yelled down by the majority. And I think, it probably won't happen in my lifetime, but the way home ownership rates are falling amongst young people, the rates are slowly dropping, but at some stage in the future on our current trajectory, we will actually have more renters than homeowners, and I think then the ball game will probably really change.
One of the things that you need to always look at history to see why things are what they are. The assumption was that people would own their own homes and they were to be given a lot of encouragement to own their own homes, and that then is reflected, assume you hit old age and you have a house of your own, you can provide for yourself, your housing in your old age, so that our pension rates are actually lower than most of the rest of the world because it's assumed that housing will have already been purchased. So we actually need to go back and draw the links about how people's well-being works across their lives and the way housing plays into that. And if we're rewriting things, we need to rewrite things more broadly so that people's concerns are dealt with and whatever.
Do-town planners speak about the fact that if you have rich suburbs and poor suburbs, it makes it very difficult for the traffic because you actually have the flow of people from the eastern suburbs going to the area, Ryde and all that, where they all the IT jobs. And you have the poor people from Liverpool who come to clean their houses. So there is that lack of mixture that makes it like a very crowded roads also. And another thing I want to speak about is there was a utopian but beautiful idea that if we would in each building reserve the ground floor for elderly, which would act like a sort of a concierge for the others who can oversee who's coming in and out, and at the same time have ground floor level easy access, it would make a nice mix in this building.
That sounds really good. I actually used to live, had an auntie lived in an apartment block where the older person on the ground floor did actually adopt that concierge strategy without actually telling them. It was very interesting. You go and try and visit your auntie, you'd be interrogated at the front door by this, the concierge. But yeah, I actually think it's trying to get some mix, is really important for lots of reasons.
I did read somewhere in the past that Menzies started this home ownership after the Second World War. He wanted everyone to become a small business person, and the ideal small business person was someone that owned their own home, and they'd be more likely to vote Liberal. Did you hear that theory, or?
Makes sense.
Because they want to protect their investment, you see. Before the Second World War, home ownership was much less, I understand.
You've only got to look at Thatcher's Britain, where they were trying to sell council housing to sitting tenants, and I think that was definitely part of her strategy. She thought homeowners would vote for the Conservatives, so I'm sure that was in the mix somewhere.
Just a comment on Thatcher's Britain. When she sold the public housing stock to sitting tenants, she sold it to them at a big discount, unlike what we're looking at now, which is no assistance, just a big kick out. At least Margaret Thatcher gave people a leg up on the way out.
She was prepared to buy their votes. I think that's fair.
They had squatters.
Any other questions,
Yes.
ladies and gentlemen? Yeah, Kathy.
Yes, I'm Kathy. I make the films, and I just joined the committee. It's 2 days ago, so it's Kathy from the committee.
You want me to hold the camera while you talk?
Yeah, if you like. Share the work. I lived in Paris for 16 years, so I just wanted to add something on about the European system. homelessness is truly life-threatening in a cold climate. So in that case, you have to apply Article 25 of the Bill of Human Rights. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd like to draw attention to is that this housing problem doesn't just affect the young, not by a long shot. It affects casual workers and it affects blue-collar workers. But there was a great episode, I think, of Four Corners that featured a nurse and a fireman. And he bought up in Gosford, she'd bought down in Wollongong.
Yeah.
Now she had, you know what, the hours that nurses work, when she left in the morning, her children hadn't woken up. She had 6 children. And when she got home at night, all but one were back in bed again. So I think you have to actually add to this. Arthur Chesterfield Evans, who comes here quite often, is a candidate for the Greens in North Sydney. And he's been trying to battle to save the Royal North Shore Hospital. And he's been talking about the parking fines that they get at 3 o'clock in the morning, the fact that they can't eat in the canteen anymore. There's no place for them to sleep anymore, the tollway. And even the canteen is $20 now, and they're not allowed to eat their own sandwiches. So we have to add this human cost as well. It's not, sure, cultural diversity and economic diversity in the inner city region it's a great thing to have, but you know, the richness of that. But in fact, there is a terrible loss. Now, I'm an academic. I owned my house in Paris, but I came back here 11 years ago, and it's only this sector has been casualised. University of New South Wales in 2006, staff 85% casual. Yeah. Now, no bank is going to give a loan to anybody who is unsure of whether they're going to have continued work. But the overall figure now for casualisation, those who have casual jobs as opposed to those who have full-time jobs, is 60% across the nation. So in fact, this affects a really wide sector of society and not just young people. And I feel that if people are on a low wage or they're working casually, they may be on a high hourly rate, that these people are going to be condemned for life. And we really do have to look after these sectors as well as our young people.
Yeah, no, well said.
Now, developers are supposed to provide a certain amount of affordable housing, and if they don't provide it, they have to pay a fee. And a lot of them don't provide it because they don't want to have poor people living in their block of flats. Now, do the speakers know what percentage of developers actually pay the fee and don't provide the stock?
You know, there's a scheme in the city around that City West Housing, and I don't think I've ever heard of a developer providing the stock. I think they just all cash out because they're scared of you know, affecting their sales price if they've got people that don't look like people in the apartment. One of the things that's interesting, we actually did some research on that last year, and I think you know, developers and real estate agents are probably missing out a little bit on you know, what's going on in the rest of society, and a lot of people actually really appreciate, you know, diversity in their suburb. In fact, the idea of living somewhere where everyone looks like you and you know, does the same thing here, for a lot of people is pretty scary because they probably realise the shallowness of their lives. I don't know, whatever it is, but you know, you got a city like New York where you've got a lot more social mix, and that's sort of part of the brand of the city. Not everyone likes it, but the people that like it really like it. So I actually think they might be missing out on, you know, not only helping, you know, people get housing in good locations, but they might be missing out on a bit of a market there.
In terms of developers contributing to affordable housing, there are only 3 schemes in New South Wales, one covering parts of the City of Sydney, Waverley and Willoughby, that collect from developers. No other local council has been allowed to. So they are 3 old schemes that have been, I guess, you know, looked after or whatever, kept. But nobody else can do it. There's provision for being able to levy developers in our Planning Act as it stands at the minute. But there's provision in our Planning Act that would allow local councils to do it, but you then have to get approval from the planning minister, and no one else has managed to get that. So it's a very small thing rather than a major thing. It is one of the mechanisms London uses, for example, to maintain some social mix. And, you know, it's true, our cities will not work. Into the future, this city will not work unless it plans for everybody and makes a place for everybody. It just cannot function.
I think that's exhausted our questions. One other question, yeah. Just while the speaker's going over there, Mary, that's a beautiful comment to make about the inclusiveness requirement, and I think it's particularly wonderful that you've made that comment so close to Harmony Day, which we celebrated last Saturday, the 21st of March. One of the central themes of Harmony Day, as everybody here would know, is that everyone belongs. So thank you for raising that particular issue at such an appropriate time of the year.
Yeah, Farmer Garden from Millers Point. I actually had two questions, but I've got a third one for the gentleman here asking about the affordable housing. As Peter might well know, at Barangaroo, the first designer quoted 7.5%. He was duly sacked, and a new designer was hired and quoted 2.3%. It's very minimal. Now, in the meantime, Land Lease, the developer, has been behind closed doors with this state government, and instead of having the affordable housing on site, they want to take public housing up in Millers Point. That's their 2.3%. So not only are we under attack from the state government, we're under attack from these developers. So the affordable housing is not going on site, they're going to take public housing. So the other two questions I had, one which Peter raised, is also it was about foreign investors. Is it not right that federal and state governments are exempt? In other words, they can sell second-hand properties instead of new properties? Because I think I found that somewhere in what I've been researching. Another thing was about the stamp duty. So in 6 months, was it $750 million roughly?
Yeah, 744 million.
Right. Yeah. So therefore, with all this money, as you quoted, as Mary and you quoted, swishing around, why then, if this government has got that much money, why then are they still selling public and social housing property? It's a disgrace.
Yeah, it's a complete disgrace. I'm not sure about the foreign citizens and government property. Mary might know. It's not a sort of full regulation I know much about. Barney, I said this before. I actually think the money's part of it for the government, but I actually think, unfortunately, part of it is, certainly. Some government officials that don't like the idea of poor people living in, what they'd call nice parts of the city. And I think there's, like envy/greed going on there that, is pretty, diabolical. And I'm on the public record many times as saying it's a cruel policy, but also a stupid policy in that, they've just got a lot more empty houses down there. There's all this rush. They're going to, sell them in 10 minutes. They're not going to do that because they're scared of spiking their own price. And I just think they're just going to eke them out in the market over a long period of time, and people wouldn't have disturbed that policy at all if they just let them be. But hopefully, we can keep, raising that as an issue, and see if we can get a better outcome for the people of Millers Point.
And it's also in regional New South Wales too. Down in Wollongong, there's a lot of sell off the houses.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, there's a lot of property being sold. My comment is back onto the affordable housing thing. I understood that the Lend Lease proposal in Barangaroo wasn't affordable housing for rent, but was affordable housing for purchase. Now, that's where you want to watch the weasel words, because affordable housing then is defined as a discount to market. So, it might be defined as affordable housing because it will be sold to people at 20% less than the market. Now, I'm just hazarding a guess here, but 20% less than the market in Barangaroo won't be in any of our books, anything that's affordable. So we've started to be quite careful how we use the words, and it's why we're very specifically now talking about affordable rental housing.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry, is there another question?
Oh God, I haven't had this many questions since I told him what was on the exam.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I think because it's such a topical area of discourse and so incredibly relevant to every generation, this is a topic that we need to bring these two wonderful speakers back again. I'm very pleased to be able to report on behalf of the committee that the committee has recently produced its next program, and on it, amongst other many worthwhile and wonderful topics, is the topic of human rights, and this is one which is very and the case for a Human Rights Act in Australia. It's a very similar case for the case in favour of a Homelessness Act, which we've discussed at various stages during the discussion tonight, as being something which is totally and manifestly inadequate at the moment, because it's nothing more, if it does become legislation in its current form or similar wording, nothing more than a charter of rights which already exist by virtue of the various universal declarations and other covenants on human rights and social justice. So we have a long way to go, and there are many researchers who argue that we haven't yet reached a condition of civilisation. It's something that we're still on our way to, and I think the cases which have been argued passionately and very, very persuasively tonight by Mary and Peter support that view very, very strongly. Thank you both so very much for